And we're live. It is Thursday, June 25th, 2020. 5:01 p.m. We're a minute late, and my sorrow and apology for that knows no bounds. You know, I thought Kate had the monologue today, but then when I reminded her of that a few minutes ago, she informed me that no, I had the monologue. And I do feel strongly that the monologue on In Lieu of Fun should never be prepared in advance. And yet being sandbagged with the monologue so that you're not even mentally prepared. I mean, I believe in not preparing for the monologue. I believe the monologue should be improvisational. I believe it should have all the uhs and likes and that, you know, actual human speech has. I believe it should be a reflection of your thinking of at the moment. And yet, I confess that being sandbagged with the monologue and finding out 3 minutes before I start speaking that I'm speaking and I have no idea what I'm talking about. And I literally, as I am saying these words, I am thinking, is there a theme to this conversation? Is there a subject that I'm monologuing about? Is all of this going to transition into something meaningful? Or am I merely whining about the fact that I did not prepare a monologue for you today? And I want to assure you it is the latter. This is going nowhere. So with that, I'm just going to say we are not allowed to have fun anymore. And I am not a good enough Virginia Heffernan type or Mike Pesca type monologuist to monologue my way into sense and sensibility. I'm not a good enough monologuist to take this somewhere. So I'm not even going to try. I'm just going to say we are not allowed to have fun anymore. But in lieu of fun, we have Camille François and her incredible background, which looks like Marseille. Am I right?
Is it Marseille? Yeah.
Yeah, it's Cassis between Marseille and Toulon, which is.
I was just gonna say that looks like Cassis. I was like, oh, I lived for 6 months in Montpellier.
Oh, you guys are the first ones to get it right. Every time I get like, oh, this looks like Germany. I'm like, Germany?
No, it doesn't look like Germany.
It's not like Germany.
Yeah,
no.
It's I'm super impressed.
Well, so as facsimiles of fun go, Camille is awesome. I have never met her before. Kate thinks she's never met her before.
No,
but
I have.
Has. And Camille is here as part of Active Measures Week, which is kind of a mini week because it's only 2 people this week. But, you know, we had a conversation the other day with Tom Ridd about the history of active measures. And I thought it'd be kind of cool to have like Camille come on and sort of bring us up to date, like not up to date as of 2016, not up to date as to like what we think the Russians might do in 2020, but up to date as to like what the Russians were up to in active measures last week. And so like, you know, breaking news here, Camille, what are the Russians up to in the active measures department last week?
So I'll tell you a little bit about the report that my team and I put out last week. It's an interesting one because it covers an active measure campaign that is indeed Russian, but that's been running for a very long time. And it's kind of one that we had all missed. And so it started in January 2014, as far as we can tell. It might have been even before that. And
it has an awesome name.
Yes. It's called.
What's its name?
Infection.
What's it? Say that again.
It is called secondary infection.
Which is beautiful. I gotta say.
Is that referring just to what is that referring to? Is it referring to what I think it is?
Yes, that's a good. It's a good segue from Thomas to that story, because indeed it is a reference to an old Russian active measure campaign that was designed to make people believe that the U.S. had created AIDS. And so it's an interesting campaign because indeed it started at least in 2014, and we saw it being active up until 2020. So it's 6 years of continuous activity. And it's unique in different ways. It was very big on forgeries. It's a campaign that used a lot of forged materials, but usually the forgeries were pretty bad. It was quite easy to tell that it was a forged document. It's a campaign that used a lot of what we call single shot burner accounts. So you would create a fake account, go on a forum, post something, and then abandon the account and never revisit it again. And it's a campaign that that spread on more than 300 sites and platforms, which of course made the discovery very complicated. There's quite a lot that I can tell you about it because we wrote this excruciating amount of detail in 150 pages. But you know, some of the things that were most surprising to me is it's a campaign that was active on a lot of events that we would recognize and are familiar with, as in events that Russia had other campaigns targeting on, right? So secondary infection in 2016 was already attacking Hillary Clinton and calling her a criminal. In 2017, secondary infection was focused on the French presidential election and attacking Macron. Secondary infection was also focused on WADA and the doping leaks scandal. So it's kind of operated in parallel from other operations we know, right? Like on moments in which we know the IRA was present, moments in which we know the GRU was present. Now we're realizing that, you know, for all these years, it was another strand of Russian active measure activity with secondary infection.
And give us a sense of what secondary, it feels weird saying secondary infection, like it makes me think of people getting I mean, obviously there's the HIV connotation, but it also in the current moment sounds like people getting coronavirus for the second time. It just has a weird valence to be speaking about this way. What does secondary infection do? Like walk us through what the Russian operation consists of and what it seeks to be trying to inject into the conversation.
Yeah, that's a good question. And to be honest, it's a hard question because, again, we're talking about 6 years of activity, right? And so there's what it's trying to do, what it's managed to do, what it failed at doing, and how it's doing all of that, right? So if I take a step back, what it's trying to do, a lot of the content of that operation across 6 years was focused on Ukraine. About 30% of the posts were just focused on Ukraine. And that's the main thing that this operation has been trying to do over the years, is to paint Ukraine as a failed state. Now, we found 9 overall themes beside things that were just focused on Ukraine. So there's also a thread that's running on painting the US and NATO as aggressors on the diplomatic scene. There's a theme that's focused on European divisions and European weaknesses, a lot of trying to pit countries against one another. There's a few of the posts that are just focused on elections, you know, the French election, the US midterm, the 2016 election. There are a set of posts that are focused on migration and Islam specifically, a set of posts that are focused on Russian doping scandals, and that's again the WADA hack, and a set of posts that's focused on Turkey, and finally, and like last leg of it, that's focused on defending Russia and its government and attacking Kremlin critics. From, you know, domestic critics like Navalny to groups like Bellingcat, who are, you know, distributed investigative groups. So what's interesting is, like, in 6 years of activity, you really see that operation being active on themes that are familiar for those who have been tracking Russian influence operations, but also Russian cyber operations, right? You kind of see 6 years of of known operations and obsession unfolding, unfolding one by one. Now, let me just touch upon what it's trying to really achieve, and the only moment where we saw it have a real impact. That's one of the big sort of mysteries of secondary infection, which is a lot of the posts it made, the documents it created, the forged material that it distributed on the internet really didn't go anywhere, right? It didn't have a lot of traction. It didn't achieve any impact that we could measure. So there's a real question on like, why did it do that for 6 years, given that it had so little impact that we could measure? But there's one specific election in which they did manage to infuse their documents right in the middle of the political debate, and that's the UK general election of December last year in 2019, which that operation secondary infection is responsible for what the UK government is now calling the first case of successful contemporary Russian interference in UK elections.
So walk us through how it works. Like what it, the IRA was basically running a whole lot of Twitter feeds and Facebook pages under false names. Obviously the GRU operation was stealing Democratic emails and dumping them through WikiLeaks. What is secondary infection doing?
Yeah, so it tried two things. There are moments in which we see secondary infection kind of play with what we know the IRA for, right? Fake personas. There was this persona called the Blue Man, and it did a lot of posts. So at some point, we do see secondary infection sort of try out this model of having fake personas. But more often than not, it does this single shot burner account trick to propagate forgery. So concretely what this means is they create a fake document. For instance, in the midterms in 2018, they make a fake tweet that looks like it's coming from Marco Rubio that complains about the Democrats partnering with British intelligence in order to interfere in the election. And then they go on multiple forums, they create fake accounts that they immediately create, post, and then abandon. And they sort of like drop their forged documents on many, many, many sites to try to see if it lands. For the few cases in which, again, we saw them have a little bit of traction, like the November UK leaks, they did that. They sort of like created the fake documents, created the fake account, put the documents on Reddit multiple times. It didn't work really well. So then they went and they created fake Twitter accounts, and they started sort of mentioning politicians and activists that they wanted to engage with the documents. That also didn't work really well. So eventually they started emailing the documents directly. And I think that last part is actually quite important, because when we think about active measures and contemporary active measures, we tend to think about, oh, those are just posts on the internet, right? They're Twitter posts and they're Facebook posts, but we tend to forget that a huge part of it also happens in DMs, in messages on platform, in emails. And secondary infection here is not an exception. We do see them use emails to go and shop around the material that they want to distribute.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead,
Kate.
Ben. No, I'm
Please.
I'm paying attention to everything you're saying, but I was trying to bring up, so this morning, I don't usually look at like who's followed me on Twitter or whatever, but this morning I just happened to be like kind of scrolling through it. And I was like, Molly CC, like long number after her name. Weird. The title was like something that was broken English. And she was an exceptionally pretty person, or seemed like very, very like, kind of like made up or kind of whatever. And she had 0 followers, and she had like 55. I'm trying to find her, but I actually flagged it for Twitter, so that's why I can't find it. But it was, but like kind of this, she had gone through and retweeted a bunch of things that were all in my network, like things that had happened to be in my network, things that like were friends of mine and stuff like that. I obviously never met Molly C. I was just like, I remember just kind of, I'm like, I knew immediately, right, that this was like, this is not a real thing. This is not a real person. This is like this thing that is exactly what Camille is talking about all the time. But like, here's what I can't understand and I'm having trouble understanding, which is like, how do you empower that anonymous, that pseudonymous profile to do anything? It just seems bad. Like maybe that's bad instances of active measures, or maybe that's just like, they put out enough of those and enough people eventually believe them. And specifically when you're using DMs and you have a very pretty profile picture and you're DMing someone that's lonely or like whatever else, that's kind of something that happens. But like, how do you weaponize that? Like, because like, I gotta say, like, 0 followers, this person has 0 followers. They've gone and followed 400 people. Like they were obviously, it was a garbage account. But I'm just like it's just like hard for me to understand how that ends up being weaponized.
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll start by saying that it's hard to give people a set of criteria that you can rely on to say this is a fake account. Particularly in moments where there is a lot of political activity. There are a lot of accounts that are coming online for the first time. There are a lot of accounts that are pseudonymous, and those can absolutely be real people. Now, as you're saying, Kate, there are also cases in which we do see totally fake accounts. And then there's this interesting period, which between the moment where the account is created and the moment in which the account has enough sort of content and grounding and audience to actually make an impact. And that moment in the, sort of like in the development of a fake account in an information operation is what we call the audience building stage. And interestingly enough, like the last few campaigns that we worked on that were Russians and that were targeting the US, they got detected and deactivated at this audience building stage. And so if you look at those accounts, they're kind of, they're just doing completely feel good content with hashtags all the time, all day long, because they're just trying to build an audience and sort of trying to engage, and they haven't done anything yet that is problematic or quote unquote weaponized, right? They're still very much in this audience building phase. And so the answer to your question is, it takes a little bit of time for a fake persona to get the gravitas that it's going to take and that it needs in order to be impactful, right?
No, that makes a ton of sense. So like, is it basically like they think if they launch 15,000 of these crappy fake accounts, if one of them breaks through and is able to build an audience, then that's like enough? Is that kind of a little bit the idea?
Well, that's definitely what we saw the IRA do, right? In 2017, I worked with the US Senate Select Intelligence Committee, and we analyzed all the data points on social media that the platforms had related to the IRA. And one of the main questions was, how did they came to have accounts that were so credible, right? Like they had a
10 GOP had incredible following.
They had, and not only just in numbers, right? They had a real followers.
No, they had Donald Trump Jr. retweeting their stuff. I mean, it wasn't just
really
the number. Yeah, it wasn't just
I forgot
the number
that
of followers. It was the right followers.
Exactly. So my favorite IRA troll from that specific period is Jenna Abrams, and she was so funny and witty in the way she was expressing herself online that she also had a lot of media followers, and a lot of her fake posts would end up in news stories, right? She's been cited in the New York Times. So it takes a little while to cultivate that audience, which is kind of why it matters to detect these accounts early and to deactivate them before they get this audience. But indeed, that means that sometimes we detect those campaigns and we're just looking at accounts and thinking, what are they doing with that? Right? So the last IRA linked campaign that we worked on with CNN and Clemson professors and Facebook and Twitter, which we call Double the Seat, was run from Ghana. And it was a handful of accounts who were just posting feel-good memes with the Black History Month hashtag all day, every day, throughout all month of the year, just because they needed to build that audience.
So tell us about Graphika. You
Yeah.
work for an organization called Graphika, with which produced this report, which you and your co-authors wrote. What is Graphika, and what does it do, and why is it investigating Russian active measures?
Yeah, that's a great question. Graphika is a network mapping firm. And so our sort of core competency is to do cartographies of the internet. And I met Graphika back when I was still working at Google and started to investigate disinformation and information operations campaign. I realized that these network mapping technologies were actually fairly helpful if you want to detect what is coordinated behavior, what's inorganic at scale. And I also thought back then that detecting and exposing those campaigns shouldn't be a one platform thing, right? Most of these campaigns are not just going to happen on Google or just going to happen on Facebook or just going to happen on Twitter. And so I wanted to create a team that could do this type of work across the entire internet and from one platform to another. And I moved to Graphika to create that team. A few fantastic colleagues joined along the way. And today we work on detecting disinformation and information operations, not just Russians, sort of from anywhere. And we try to bring a whole of the internet approach to this detection work.
And what does that mean in practice? What is a whole of the internet approach? Yeah. And how, what's the relationship between cartography and, which I really think of as, people sitting there drawing maps, or the kind of digital equivalent of that. What's the relationship between cartography and anti-information operations?
Yeah, I'll address those two questions separately because I think they're both great. So let me talk about secondary infection to illustrate this whole of the internet question, right? The reason why we know about this operation is because back in May of 2019, Facebook found 21 pages on its own services and said, something's odd with those. Those are not real. They're part of an information operation originating from Russia. And here are the 21 pages. And back then, they didn't have any reason to believe that this was just a minuscule, part of the iceberg for something that is much bigger than Facebook and much bigger than those 21 accounts. And if you look at all these operations only from each platform, indeed, you will only see small tidbits, peaks of the puzzle. And what we had to do is take those 21 assets and unravel the tapestry one by one across each platform on the internet. We realized that there were other assets on YouTube, on Blogspot, on Medium, on Reddit, on Quora, on the BuzzFeed community forum. But it's none of these platforms sort of, job to go and figure out the entire picture. You kind of need people to unravel the entire operation and to look at it, not just from, I want to know how many Twitter accounts there are, but from a perspective of, I want to understand the full scope of that thing. So that's for, what I call the whole of the internet approach. For secondary infection, we ended up working with 9 different platforms to take action on that campaign, which I think is actually the sort of the biggest coalition of platform taking joint action on a campaign. It's interesting because I think when we think about information operations, people say Twitter, Facebook, and Google, but we ended up working really well with platforms like Quora or,
right.
So it spreads it's much more cross-platform as a problem that we often think it is.
So I found a couple of accounts that I think will be illustrative, and I'm trying to, okay, I'll use this. So the first one is like, I wanted like kind of, I think that this is like fun. So I'm just going to share my screen here for a second. And I'm really eager to hear your thoughts on this. So here is my, okay, here is my screen. This is Annie Martin 5353. I was tipped off by the fact that it was a completely generic name and that there were multiple digits, random digits after the name. She has been on since January 2020. And then she was 70, like the ratio here is pretty telling to me, 1,000 following to 77 followers. And every single thing is a retweet. There is nothing, and it's all political. See, like Lincoln Project, George Conway. It's all kind of political stances here. Yeah, Jonah Goldberg. There is nothing really that is there. She said 29,000 tweets, and they've all been retweets. Okay. And so that's kind of, and there's like no pictures. There's nothing there. Then there's like, in contrast, Matthew Morris, 847-84521 is a 1 follower, 269 following. And again, all political. Here's Bolton's book. And that's the only thing that he's retweeted. He's only had 2 tweets. He's been on since June. And he has 1 follower. But Annie has, 77. Okay, who knows? Likes. These are all of the things that they like. They're all political writers, politics, like things like that. People who are pretty in this kind of movement. I think this is like fascinating, honestly.
So when you see something like that, Camille, do you assume that that person is somebody who's got political instincts and wants to share stuff, but doesn't want to speak him or herself, is really just a kind of amplifier of other stuff that's going on? Do you assume that person is a bot? Do you assume, what should our baseline assumptions about an account like that be?
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Perfect question.
Okay, I'm gonna start by answering Ben's question from before, and then we're gonna transition to your question, because they're gonna be linked. Do you see my new Zoom background?
I do. It is like a bunch of dots, or colorful dots. It looks like a map. That's a network map. So that is actually the network map of the traditional US political landscape in 2016. And it shows the different communities that are engaged with the accounts of US Congress. It shows how they're connected to one another, and it shows which different accounts are most influential within that landscape. So here, every node on the map, every dot is an account. Here, this is a Twitter account. The size of the dot is the influence of that specific account within this network, within this landscape. And the position of these dots relative to one another is a measure of how much attention they're paying to one another. And so here on sort of my right shoulder, you have the conservative side of the US political landscape. On the other side, you have liberal side, and in the middle, you have accounts who are really well connected with both and who everybody in this landscape is following, right? And so for instance, here, those big nodes are going to be the New York Times, right? Accounts that everybody is paying attention to within that network. And so when we do cartography, we see a lot of these conversations from all around the world, including spontaneous conversations, right? We see what does the picture, the cartography of an online protest looks like, right? The Hong Kong protest, the Gilets jaunes protest. And that tells us something about the extraordinary diversity of online behavior. And that goes to your question, Kate, which is, when you look at so many different protests all around the world, or events, or weird K-pop campaigns, or people talking about Beyonce, you realize how diverse online behavior is. So my assumption is always that an account that looks weird is just a different pattern of engaging online.
And that's because I've seen organic moments with a lot of accounts that were just created, right? Sometimes, for instance, a protest is a good example. If you look at the Gilets jaunes movement in France, you have a lot of newly created account that's not bizarre, that's not even suspicious. It's because when something happens and it's online, people want to join the conversation. So my baseline assumption is always, if it looks bizarre to you, perhaps this is just that they don't use the internet the way you do. But there are ways in which you can actually decide whether an account is inauthentic. Sometimes an account has been hacked, right? Someone is saying, actually, this is my account. Sometimes it's impersonating, right? You're able to see that the person isn't who they say they are. So, Kate, we were just talking about Daphne. Daphne this morning was posting on Twitter, like, someone is using my name and my face and DMing.
Daphne Keller?
Right.
Yeah.
Like, that's a good, straightforward definition of, there's no doubt about this account is inauthentic. And sometimes you have signs that really should make you question what's happening, right? So we worked on a campaign a few months ago with a lot of accounts that seemed connected to one another. So we were looking at a network and we couldn't really tell what was going on. And we could see that there was something bizarre with those accounts, but I couldn't tell exactly why. I couldn't put my finger on it. And one of our analysts said, the ears are wrong. And I looked at her and I said, what do you mean by that?
Okay, can I quickly break in, because this is actually exactly what the next thing, and you've dovetailed into it perfectly. This is a site called, and I'm sure you know it, Camille. This is using GAN technology in order, like, this is a lot of the stuff that Bobby Chesney and Danielle Citron write about. But I am obsessed with this. There's a Twitter feed that like regularly posts these images, but this person does not exist. This is a person whose face was generated by technology. And if you like you refresh the page, they give you a new picture of a person that like their face was generated by like technology. And it just kind of goes on. And they all look completely real. And often the only distinguishing factor is like weird stuff in the background. Like the hair here is like a little strange as it like maneuvers into the thing. But actually all four of these have not been that weird. But what's really kind of amazing about like, this is actually a great example of where the background. So what actually often happens with GAN technology is that it can not recognize or cannot generate the background noise kind of consistently. It can do a really good job. It's learned really well how to like construct a human face and the flaws and the beauty of a human face, but it like can't. So like in the background, there's like I have no idea what that is, honestly.
Like, it looks like an ear.
Yeah, I was gonna say it looks like a mutilated like face / vagina / like teeth. Like I have no idea what's going on. It's just very not great. I'm not a fan. I'm gonna click through. But anyway, so here's we'll end with this. So there's like, these.
Stay on this one, Kate, because
yeah,
the reason why I spotted the ear, and she was right, of course. She was saying like, hey, all the ears, they're not symmetrical.
Yeah.
It was her clue to the fact that all the faces that we were seeing as part of this campaign were fake faces generated by GAN. This led to a report which we called Operation FFS because we were really mad.
Is that for fuck's sake?
Well, we claim that it's fake face swarm, but yes, it was for fuck's sake because this operation, and it was fake faces with fake faces. And in that case, they were actually tied to an online property called the BL, the Beauty of Life, which is in itself an offshoot of the Epoch Media Group. So it's like another difficult story. But my point was, symmetry is hard for the specific generation of GAN that is producing the image that you're looking at. So here you can look at the two branches of the glasses, right? They're sort of slightly asymmetrical. And if you have a picture with earrings, you'll see that often they don't match. But
I actually think that we can maybe, I can't go back because I've just been refreshing. I'll try to go forward. I think that it amazing that they have like the flyaways and just like this tiny little freckle right here, and like slightly jagged teeth, like not perfect teeth. I don't know that it's I'm trying to find one with an earring. Oh, is it better? Is it a flag that like you can only see one ear all the time because they know that they can't get it right?
No, so that's not intent. That's just the machine doing its thing. Sometimes if you click a few more, you'll get like
the ear's really weird there.
Yeah. Oh, ear's a good tell. But the thing that's actually quite worrisome here is you see how easy it is to just generate fake faces? I tell you, when you have a long set of faces, it's much harder to find a reliable tool that scans for this type of activity. And we were looking at, like thousands of pages, and I didn't want to spend like nights and weekends looking at ears and comparing earrings. So we ended up finding one university in Italy who had done a specific experimental classifier to detect GAN faces. But let me tell you, like to date, it is much harder to detect a GAN face than to create a GAN face, because as you pointed, you just go online and you generate as many as you want.
It's just amazing. I'm just like,
it is amazing.
I just, I could like click through these forever. I just kind of like, and every time I'm trying to be like, okay, but these are two really good ears. Like, let's be honest, those are some good ears. Like,
I mean,
I'm just waiting for a GAN face to have one gray eyebrow and one brown eyebrow. Then I'll know that it has arrived. So
sorry, go ahead,
I guess I want to get your sense of what, return to the question of what secondary infection may have achieved. So it's not a particularly expensive set of operations to run, as Bob Mueller found about the IRA. So it's a low investment strategy, but a huge amount of its effort is wasted. And they're persistent at it for 6 years before you come along and say, hey, by the way, there's this secondary infection thing. And it'll morph into something else now. But I guess I'm trying to figure out, what do you think they get out of it? And how do you understand when you're dealing with it in or watching it in an adversarial context, how do you understand who the they is? Is it just some amorphous Russian entity? Do you assume it's the government? What do you assume? Like who is it and what are they getting out of it?
Yeah, you just summarized the two biggest questions around secondary infection. It's very difficult to answer them because, unlike the IRA, unlike the GRU units whose operations we're familiar with, we can't say exactly which entity is behind secondary infection. So we can say that this activity originates from Russia. We can say that it lasted 6 years. We see that it's following the Russian geostrategic priorities. And we see that it consistently maintains high OPSEC, which means that it never kind of, slips. It doesn't show its IP. It doesn't reuse email addresses. It's really, they're investing in not being discovered. So all of this we see, but nobody to date, including, all the platforms and technical partners that we worked with, is able to pinpoint exactly which unit, which organization is secondary infection. And without that means that any motive we can assign is really our best guess, right? So I can give you what I think they're trying to do. But honestly, without knowing exactly which organization is behind it and why it was funded for 6 years, it's quite hard to make a high confidence determination of what exactly is going on.
So what's your low confidence guess?
So I've spent bizarre amount of time, years with the IRA data. This does not look like the IRA to me. It doesn't look like any version of the IRA that I have known from 2014 to 2019. It's also quite different from the GRU operations that I've studied, but it's closer to that than it is from the IRA. And my guess is that, my low confidence guess is that it's probably a third and distinct entity. Perhaps it's a governmental entity that we haven't seen being active in the space, or perhaps it's a different GRU unit. But to me, it's definitely closer in its tradecraft to the GRU than it is to the IRA.
So
go ahead, Kate. No.
Okay, I was just going to say that I think that so one of the things, it's really interesting. I've been trying to put together for a long time kind of like how to think about, there are just so many types of mis and disinformation. Everyone who studies this knows this, right? But lay people really throw them all together kind of in this massive kind of heap of garbage, right? And it's like, it is a heap of garbage, but they are like, there are some that are concerted and that are like very much trying to have a purpose, and there's some that are just trollish and just want to disrupt things, and there are some that are just, I don't know, like just kind of people fucking around. I just have no idea. But what I would really love to know is that like Tom Reid really thought that the American reaction, and I will say that like following the 2016 reaction, was part of 3 like bizarrely secretive closed panel groups at Yale and Harvard and Columbia that all like were like panels that they brought together people to try to fight disinformation after the 2016 election. And there wasn't even close to a consensus about what disinformation meant, what fake news was, what all of these things meant. And I kept saying things like disinformation is a lot like spam. We should treat it like spam, which is kind of like was a tilt towards like the concerted disinformation kind of idea, which is now kind of commonplace. No one bought that. Everyone was like, no, this is like about this other thing. My point, I guess, is just like Tom Reid thought that like we had given too much. I would say that, and Ben, tell me if I'm wrong, but his conceptualization was that we had given too much air to the fire. Like that they had like set this like tiny little tinder, and that like with this active measure, and that like our reaction to it was so huge that like it completely like it created the fire that we thought already existed, kind of. So I guess my question to you is, do you agree with Tom? Do you think that that's what's happened? Or do you think that there's actually really like, that there are just kind of like, that there are a lot, and like, okay, I'll rephrase my second part of my question. If you agree with Tom, or if you don't agree with Tom, what do you think we do in reaction to finding out about like more that misinformation, that like these types of profiles exist, that people are trying to do things? What do we do instead of reacting and feeding the fire?
Yeah. First, I agree with you. I agree that disinformation is poorly defined, and it's a grab bag of stuff that have nothing to do with one another. The fact that your uncle says weird stuff on the internet has literally nothing to do with what the GRU is doing on Facebook, and shouldn't belong in the same umbrella. I use the ABC framework to sort of separate the different dimensions of what can make disinformation. It can be because it's coming from a manipulative actor. It could be because it's a distorted behavior, or it could be because the content itself is a disinformation problem. So for instance, posts that are designed to tell you that an election is happening on a day where it's not happening. But all of these dimensions sort of like chart out different types of problems which warrant different types of solutions. So now let me take you like one step further down the rabbit hole. If you focus only on information operations, you recognize that a lot of them are carried out by private actors, So there's an entire market of information operations for hire, right? Including PR firms that are working on behalf of different states. And if you focus sort of one step further down the rabbit hole on information operations that are carried by foreign governments, and again, one step down the rabbit hole, only operations that are carried by foreign governments that happen to be Russia, you still find an extraordinary diversity of these operations and a lot of evolution across the years. And what's been interesting is we have had such a pendulum swing in our reaction to Russian interference that I do believe that we went too far in the other direction. If you look at the ODNI assessment of January 2017, they don't even care about the IRA back then. They talk about RT, and there's literally like one small reference to a journalist that talks about trolls. And then we start obsessing with Russian interference on social media. By 2018, the Russians know that, and the campaigns that they design are designed to play in our own fear of Russian interference. So during the midterms in 2018, there's this entire campaign that's designed to say, look how good we are about interfering, right? The campaign is about the interfering itself. It's meta trolling. Even with secondary infection, the recent things that target US election are about interference. So in 2018, the midterm posts are about, hey, the Dems are actually working with GCHQ to do interference. In 2019, they're saying, and now the Democrats are working with Russian military intelligence. So our own obsession not only is making the problem worse, but also is providing air to operations that are now meta, right? That are just focused on our own fear of interference. So I agree with Tom.
We have a question from Christopher. Christopher, the floor is yours.
Yeah, hi, thanks for taking the question as usual. I have one question. If you look at the individual campaigns that you analyzed in the past few years, and at some point of each analysis, you presuppose a motive from the part of the agent. Could you explain how you measure the accomplishment when you look at the whole campaign that you analyze, or the lack of an accomplishment? So if they achieve it or not, how do you measure this?
That's such a great question.
Christopher always asks great questions. I always love it when his name shows up in the Q&A, because I don't even have to read the question. I just know he's good for a good question every time.
I also kind of feel like it's Werner Herzog asking the question, because all German accents sound the same to me.
Christopher, you can pretend you didn't hear that last comment, but thank you for the question. Camille, the floor is yours.
Yeah. I'm going to do something that's intellectually dishonest, and instead of answering, I'm going to explain why it's complicated to answer that question. How do you measure impact of an information operation? You have at least three problems. The first one is you can look at online impact, right? Like measure the number of times something was liked, measure the number of times something was shared. But that doesn't give you really the answer to your question, because as we said at the beginning, it doesn't matter how many times it was retweeted, it matters who it reached, right? So you need a network approach like we're doing, right? You need to understand how it's impacting the network. Who are the communities who are engaging with it? An information that's been retweeted 1 billion times by a bunch of bots on a dark corner of the universe doesn't really matter. It matters much more if it's been shared a smaller number of times, but by the people that you're trying to target. So those are the complexities of measuring the online impact. You have to think about the network effect. Now there's the offline impact, right? Perhaps an operation didn't have a lot of impact online, but perhaps it drew people in the street. In 2016 and 2017, the IRA designed operations where people were drawn to meet all, offline and sort of like entice to violence. That is really hard to measure. And an operation that has a low footprint online but has a real impact offline is much more dangerous. And finally, there's everything that you don't know. And we have to remain humble vis-a-vis our own understanding of information operation. There is so much that we don't know. Let me give you one specific example. When I investigated what the IRA did in 2017, I sat with the activists who had been targeted. They were showing me DMs. They had had long conversation with trolls, conversations that we don't know about, right? When secondary infection is putting out the leaks in the UK election, they're using emails. There's an entire world of information operation that's unraveling in private conversations that you can't see. And those two have an impact that is really hard to measure. So that's kind of a long-winded answer to say there's no easy way to measure that impact. It's really hard because of all these different complexity and because of everything we don't know.
Camille, this has been amazing. Thank you so, I mean, I don't want to wrap up quite yet, but I just have to say, this is awesome. I know, but it's so fun. Sorry, go ahead.
I have a question that I think a lot of people are probably wondering about, which is how you got into this. So your bio that as you've teased it out along the course of this conversation, is that you've done work for Google, you've done, you did investigative work for the Senate Intelligence Committee on its Russia investigation. You've worked for Graphika, doing this sort of work. And I think I first became aware of you when you had some kind of affiliation with the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard, if I'm not making that up. So who the hell are you and how did you get to be doing this stuff?
Can I two-finger that and also ask, because after spending time, as I mentioned in the pre-show, that after spending a lot of time in France, I find the French infrastructure around the internet and around telecom to be so behind other kind of countries. And I'm sorry to say that so bluntly, but I mean, I think that's actually indisputable. It's just there,
right?
What do you say?
Not talking about our Minitel, right? Because we love our Minitel.
Yeah, exactly. That is exactly what I'm talking about. There was, and that's what I love about France. And that's part of the reason that I and that's fine. I just kind of it is kind of, I am interested in where you grew up and what your background was that you kind of got to this place.
I'm going to try, this is a tough question to answer, so I'm going to do my best. I think it's both very bizarre and also very logical. I didn't really choose to study information operation. I kind of fell down this rabbit hole, but I think I understand how I found my way there. Ben, when you met me, I was working on cyber peace, and it was years ago when nobody wanted to say the sentence out loud. And basically, my key question was, when we think about cyber conflict, why do we frame it in terms of cyber warfare? What is the role of human rights in addressing cyber conflict? My background is in human rights. And how does cyber conflict affect people who are not nations, right? How does cyber conflict affect journalists and human rights activists and civil society organizations? And that largely is sort of the question that carried me throughout the years. When I was at Google, I was quite focused on cyber incidents, again, or digital repression incidents who were targeting non-state actors. And when I was talking to people who get hacked and who get targeted, I remember around 2014, 15, people who started saying, yeah, I have, phishing attempts problem and hacking problems and all that, but I'm worried about the trolls and I'm worried about the disinformation. And I thought this was particularly interesting because I thought that it could be the case that the same people online who were hacking people, who were designing phishing campaigns, could also be behind the disinformation and online harassment.
Yeah.
For you to say yes,
Preach.
but trust me, back then, it was a bizarre idea. People didn't.
No, but it was not a bizarre idea to the victims that you were talking about, right? Talking to. It was right. I mean, I have been the subject of repeated phishing attempts, some of them relatively sophisticated, and an ongoing information operation. And it is never dawned on me that they're unrelated to one another, right? I mean, one is, and I think to anybody who's been on the receiving end of these, they're different sides of the same blade. One is cut you with like what false information they can spread about you, or in my case, it's actually true information, just out of context, repeated over and over and over again. And the other side of the blade is, can they get you to click on something stupid, right? And then they have your emails and they'll release those.
Exactly. And so I could see that. The people I was working with and talking to could see that. And I wanted to bring the same rigor that we have when we investigate cyber incidents to these questions. We do attributions for cyber incidents, right? We don't tell people, oh, I'm so sorry you get hacked. Attribution is difficult on the internet. We'll never tell you who it was coming from, right? So I wanted to bring that, the desire to take meaningful action on it, accountability, real forensics, a rigorous playbook to study and expose that stuff. And I wanted this for information operation, targeted harassment, and troll farms. And so it was interesting to sort of, again, we talked about the pendulum shift. I think it's vivid in my mind because I lived it from nobody wanted to talk about troll farms. It was just a bizarre and obscure topic to suddenly people just would not stop. And everybody you disagreed with on the internet now was a Russian troll. So yeah, that's kind of like how I ended up there. And then it was really fun. And
but you've really this is like, everyone loves your work, and for good reason. It is really people in the companies and people outside the companies, people in academia and otherwise, you are doing all of the best stuff. Yeah, it's just incredible to have you on. This was really fun. Thank you for tolerating my like walking through a bunch of troll accounts. I thought that would be like the thing that's really hard, I think, is for people to kind of thread the needle between like their own personal experience with any type of disinformation and like the amorphous idea of disinformation and what it's trying to accomplish. And so like, I just was kind of trying to, that was really great. So thank you for tolerating that like little divergence.
No, it was a great example of something that I think lots of people in our audience have seen and wondered about and scratched their heads about. And Camille, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, guys. This was I know we're not supposed to have fun. I think I have failed the test.
You're not the first one.
You're not allowed to admit you had fun.
Oh well, then.
But we try to
don't blow up our spot.
A reasonable facsimile of fun. Speaking of which, tomorrow we are going to have Dan Byman, who made a brief cameo the other day with a question for one of our previous guests, and I've been trying to get Dan on the show for a while. Dan is a terrorism and Middle East expert and a particularly facsimile of fun kind of guy to talk to. So that will be at 5 o'clock Eastern time tomorrow. And until then, Kate?
We don't have fun anymore. And so in lieu of fun, don't believe the faces you see on the internet are real.
I think that's right.
Look at it.
Including this one. Not real. I really look like this.
Thanks, Ben.
See you tomorrow.
Dad joke. Bye.